All right, thank you again so much for joining us this morning. I'm Colin Moore. I'm going to be moderating our first panel, Old Plans for a New Hawaii, What History Can Teach Us About Our Economic Future. And I'm very happy the economists let me work in a history panel into this to start this conference. So first I want to thank our sponsors, AIO, Tradewind Group, and Narit Hawaii. The goal of this panel is to explore the plans and economic development projects of the 60s, 70s, and 80s, a period characterized by concerns over the development of agricultural lands amid urban development, the decline and fall of the sugar plantation industry, the preservation of natural resources, population growth, and economic recession. These challenges led to one of the most active periods of civic engagement in Hawaii's modern history. And one thing we'd like to understand in this panel is the reaction to that period of explosive growth during the 60s and the policies that were put in place to manage the growth, policies and institutions that are still with us today. So let's return for a moment to that era. And to set the stage, I'd like to read what former Lieutenant Governor Tom Gill said when he launched his campaign for governor in 1970. If we allow the forces that have shaped our society for the last dozen years to continue undirected, our islands will lose much of their human and physical charm. Our present course is to turn Honolulu into a sordid suburb of Los Angeles and much of the neighbor islands into bellhop villages. But Gill continued to note that we didn't have to allow this to happen. He said we could moderate our explosive growth, build permanent and pleasant housing, prevent the paving of our open green spaces, develop transportation methods which do not destroy the earth and poison the air, and diversify our economic base for greater stability and a variety of earning skills. And I think this captures the sense of urgency many felt after the growth of the 60s. And consequently, during the 70s, we see this flowering of new experiments in planning, management, and natural resource protection. One of the most ambitious was the Commission on the Year 2000, which convened in 1970 and arguably laid many of the intellectual foundations for planning and policy in Hawaii for the next decade. George Chaplin, the editor-in-chief of the Honolulu Advertiser, described the reason for its establishment. We need talent, motivation, and positive, aggressive plans. Most of our plans are too small, and even these we frequently abort. Given big goals, we need public policies devised to achieve them. This commission eventually included some of Hawaii's most creative thinkers. It met for 10 months across the state, and then a governor's conference brought together 300 task force members and 400 citizens to evaluate their recommendations. Can you imagine trying to pull off something like that today? It was a remarkable endeavor. Eventually, these discussions led to the publication of this report in 1973. It's now 50 years old. And some of these ideas, I was looking through it again last night, some of these ideas clearly are a product of the 1970s. They do talk about underwater houses and flying cars, but a lot of them hold up very well today. To be sure, we're still talking about a lot of the same things: diversifying the economy, creating enough housing, providing a minimum standard of living for everyone, and protecting our natural resources. But even if we're talking about many of the same problems, whenever I consult this report, I'm struck by how different the attitude was. There's an energy and optimism that runs through this book that's hard to imagine in our more cynical age today. And I think it's a good reminder that Hawaii was an ambitious place that thought it could do big things and solve big problems. And of course, eventually, some of the ideas in this report led to the visionary 1978 state plan and the 1978 Constitutional Convention, which we'll talk about, better known as CONCON, which in its historic preamble, I think still the best preamble of any state constitution, claimed that we have the right to control our destiny, to nurture the integrity of our people and culture, and to preserve the quality of life we desire. So we're here today to better understand these old ideas to create a new Hawaii. What worked? What didn't? What can we learn from past efforts to develop and diversify our economy? And if the ideas were good, why in many cases have we've struggled so much to implement them? I'm pleased now to welcome our guests. I'm not sure there's anyone more qualified to help us understand and answer these questions than our three panelists. First, we have with us Tom Kaufman, an independent researcher, writer, and producer. He graduated from the William Allen White School, Kansas University, with a bachelor's degree in journalism. In 1978, he wrote Catch a Wave, one of my very favorite books, a widely read account of Hawaii politics and turmoil of that period. Kaufman's work has won national awards for production of video, film, interactive media, and multi-image. 3 of his books, Nation Within, The Island Edge of America, and I Respectfully Dissent, received Kapalapalapo'okela Awards for Excellence in Nonfiction from the Hawaii Book Publishers Association. And Kaufman received the Hawaii Award for Literature, the highest recognition given by the state of Hawaii for outstanding literary achievement. Governor John Waihee received his bachelor's degree in history and business from Andrews University in Michigan and his law degree from the University of Hawaii in 1976. His political career began with his election to the Constitutional Convention of 1978. In 1980, he was elected to the House of Representatives. In 1982, he was elected lieutenant governor. And in 1986, he became Hawaii's 4th elected governor and the first elected governor of Hawaiian ancestry. And finally, we have Senator Carol Fukunaga, who received her bachelor's and her law degree from She served, again, like Governor Waihee, in the Con of 1978. She then served in the House of Representatives from 78 to 82, again from 86 to 92. She served in the state Senate from 92 to 2012. From 2012 to 2022, she served on the Honolulu City Council, and she now represents District 11 in the Hawaii Senate. So as we get started, I'm going to start with Tom. And I think this will be one of the very best short history lectures of how Hawaii got from statehood to the early 70s. So I'm going to turn it over to Tom to sort of set the stage for this panel.
Thank you, Colin. Aloha to everyone. This is going to be statehood in 5 minutes or less. And bear with me, because inevitably I will tell you things that you know, but hopefully I'll remind you of a few things that you haven't thought about for a while, or maybe even a little something that you don't know. And it is also, my brief thoughts here are organized around a premise that statehood was basically about 2 things. It was about a greater democratic empowerment and the acceleration of development. If there was a single identifiable theme of the earliest years, it was, if you recall, we are now first class. The idea of becoming first class pervaded many different sectors of our activity and of society. Right? Having our own elected governor and voting representative in the United States Senate and House certainly had its value. More existentially, empowerment brought dignity, and it brought specific rewards, such as connection to the Interstate Highway Fund, which brought in enormous amounts of 90% federal money. Empowerment on a social level and economic level lightened the grip of the Big Five. The excesses of white privilege were wound down. Society became more genuinely integrated. The idea of a multiracial, multi-ethnic, and multicultural community, which had been romantically, I think, subscribed to old Hawaii, to territorial Hawaii, took on a much more truthful currency in the new state of Hawaii. The process of development, stimulated by statehood, accelerated with a disorienting rapidity. The arrival of gigantic wide-bodied jets, massive injections of capital in what previously had been a capital-poor economy, and the development of mass tourism all happened overnight in tandem with one another. Landscapes changed, environments degraded, community, village, and rural lifestyles were displaced. We lapped up the economic progress, but started to shudder at the price. If first class was the slogan, build was the verb. As I was driving in this morning, in my head, I made a list under the word build. In this brief few years, the Capitol was built as a symbol, a very ambitious and expensive symbol. We lose track of the fact, Neil Blaisdell Center and the concert hall were built at the same time. H1 started. Honolulu Stadium was built. Ala Moana Center grew. The reef runway at Honolulu Airport, along with all the support areas that went with it, was built. Hawaii Kai, Salt Lake, and so on. And on the neighbor islands, Kona, the Gold Coast, as it was unfortunately called for a while, until people didn't like those words. And on Maui, West Maui, and on Kauai, Poipu, right? All of this was more or less going on in the same short time frame in the early several years of statehood. And as it was happening, sugar was in retreat, and the signs of collapse had appeared, but nobody was prepared to believe it because sugar had gone on for 125 years, so surely it wouldn't all go away. But in fact, it was starting to go away, and it did go away. And I think we could return to some of the never really explored whys of that, I think, and perhaps we should. Nonetheless, because of the intensity of activity, the intensity of investment, and the very rapid growth of the American economy in the 1960s, I once calculated that the state budget was growing at 18% a year, compounded during the early years of the Burns administration. So it was, over a 4 or 6 year period. So, John, you talk about a governor who had money to spend. And it made a huge difference because it facilitated this tremendous investment in infrastructure, which translated to the economy. Rapid development raised the question of, we've alluded to this, but we need to return to it, the question of development where, development by whom, development for whose benefit, and under what regulatory regime. It is instructive that the statewide zoning law, the land use law, passed, which we've talked about forever, right? Passed in the 1959 legislature, the year of statehood. So it was really anticipatory. A lot of things were added thereafter, but the land use law was in 1959, and it was anticipatory. Empowerment collided with rapid development. Almost immediately, ever larger protests sprang up. Island attempts to shape and limit clashed with grandiose continental-sized designs. In this context, the rediscovery of the revitalization, the revival of Hawaiian life challenged the hegemony of the Western model of thinking. And not far beneath this soil lay the facts of Hawaii's tragic history, to be retrieved and to be given new meaning. In this regard, lower income Hawaiians, as the largest identifiably disadvantaged demographic group, were a canary in the coal mine. Hawaiians were disproportionately vulnerable to auxiliary effects of this rapid change: rising costs of living, income inequality, an eventual tripling of the population, sky-high inflation of housing driven by a global market, and a below-average wage labor market. In ways that Hawaiians were afflicted by displacement, houselessness, homelessness, addiction, others less visibly followed and quickly. With these stresses in motion, and I'm talking really about somewhere between 1959 and 1970, at which point they became the explicit debate of the Burns-Gill Democratic primary, which I wrote about. Two things happened thereafter. One was the much referenced Kaho'olawe protest. One was the much celebrated canoe, the non-instrument voyaging canoe, Hokulea. The result was a mixture of a renewed pride in the past, a righteous anger about the present, and hope for the future. The environmental awakening of 1970 and thereafter provided a running theme, as did Governor George Ariyoshi's ongoing promotion of a state plan that would, he argued, create both a balanced environment and a balanced society. That Hawaii was in the middle of a paradigm shift may not be the only way to make sense of what happened next, but it certainly is one way. You might say, more modestly, an inflection point, a watershed, a reformation of culture that became politicized, a change in worldviews. Otherwise, if we do not acknowledge that there was an enormous change that went on in our society in the mid-1970s, the startling changes of the 1978 Constitutional Convention are an anomaly, a puzzle that makes no sense. And with that, I will introduce or bring up Governor Carol. Okay, Senator Carol Fukunaga.
Aloha, everyone. I think when you talk about the 1978 Constitutional Convention, much is made of the fact that it was supposed to have been one that was not comprised of politicians. And today, politicians are really viewed so negatively. I think for those of us who have been in public service, the last few years of COVID and now Maui wildfire disasters has really amplified the many frustrations and anger and really inadequacies of state and county government to come to grips with many, many of our pressing problems today. At the time of the Constitutional Convention, what was kind of interesting for many of us who served for the first time was that there was a big difference between the 1968 convention versus the 1978 convention. In 1968, you had only 8 women delegates, whereas in 1978, there were 30. In 1978, almost half of all the CONCON delegates were 34 years old and younger. With respect to where people came from, 70% of the delegates were born in Hawaii, with roughly 26% from the mainland and 4% from other countries. With respect to ethnicity, which was kind of a prevailing notion during the 1978 CONCON, that you really wanted to have people who represented their communities, neighbor island, Oahu, rural versus urban, etc. We had 14.7% who identified themselves as Hawaiian or part Hawaiian, 29% as Caucasian, 40% as Japanese American, 9% as Chinese American, 3% and slightly smaller percentages for Filipino, Korean, and other ethnicities. What is really interesting is that in terms of occupations, Professor Kosaki identified the fact that unlike the 1968 convention, which had a preponderance of business individuals, lawyers, and doctors, in the 1978 CONCON, you actually had an increase in educators, retirees, students, and civil service employees. In fact, during the 1968 CONCON, incumbents had made up roughly 45% of the delegates, whereas in the 1978 CONCON, there were only 2 senior statesmen, Senator Bob Tyra and Senator Donald Ching, whereas most of the rest were really community people as well as political novices. In the 1978 CONCON, though, almost 30 or more ran for office subsequently, and of course, Governor Waihee is one of the alumni of that convention. You also had Mayor Jeremy Harris, OHA Chair Frenchie DeSoto, and a whole host of others who ran for Board of Education, county councils, and state legislators among them. Now, the thing that is really most kind of interesting about the 1978 CONCON, which was kind of characterized as sort of the People's Convention, was that a lot of the values that had been articulated have been talked about time and again. And in many ways, the times that we find ourselves in today are sort of reflective of where we were back then. So it may well be that the values that were articulated in the preamble of the 1978 Constitutional Convention still serve us well as reflecting Hawaii's values. The question is, how do we harness those values in decision-making and working together in ways that move us more rapidly towards our objectives than the very ponderous and burdensome bureaucratic means that we often find ourselves in. One thing that I wanted to kind of note from what we talked about earlier was the preamble also focuses on the state's Hawaiian heritage, its uniqueness as an island state, the beauty of Hawaii and the importance of treating it with respect, the right of Hawaii's people to control their destiny, and the enduring need to nurture Hawaii's various cultures. And so in many respects, that tension of how you reflect those values and come up with practical decisions is what really bedevils us today. And I can say that in many ways, the CONCON was reflective of a time when there was a lot of aloha and respect in working together with people. You know, Bill Patey was our CONCON president, and of anyone, Bill Patey really reflected in a very compelling way that level of respect and aloha. So the level of civility, of respect, was paramount. It was almost like working with your parents and grandparents on a day in, day out basis. And so, of course, you never wanted to piss them off, but also you wanted to move them forward as smoothly as you could. And so during that 10 and a half week period, I think the compelling outcomes that we saw were largely driven by many of the younger delegates. And as some of them ran for future political office, they then brought that sense of respect and aloha, as well as pushing against status quo to make change happen. Where we are today, however, is sort of where we start to see those kinds of early efforts break down. And so I think the lessons learned from the pandemic is that we have to be a lot more mindful and respectful of those in every community. I think for us here in Hawaii, one of the things that was most exciting in the aftermath of CONCON was that Hawaii's legislature became the first in the country to offer public access to online information, all the bills, committee reports, etc. We championed the use of personal computers and technology in state government, looking to speed up the process and find ways to accelerate good things happening. And finally, as we come forward today, now we have to deal with many of the problems and excesses that technology also subjects us to, whether on TikTok, social media, or any other kinds of platforms. But I think for Hawaii, the fact that we have this very strong set of cultural and heritage values places us in a good position to figure out how best to use all of those tools in moving Hawaii forward. Thank you.
Aloha. You know, it's kind of ironic because I was at the University of Hawaii yesterday teaching a class to a group of very enthusiastic young people about the same era and about the Constitutional Convention and the rest. And what was so exciting was that was remembering and discussing those various years. Really, Tom talked about the 1970s and the energy, which is true. I mean, the people who, the democratic revolution that took place in 1954 were comprised of people who wanted to make this the greatest place in the world. And they were totally determined to do it. And they had certain characteristics. First of all, they were really patriotic. They had just gone through a war. They were really patriotic. They, and so if you wanted to protest the bombing of Kaho'olawe, it was an uphill swim because these guys thought that that was not done. So they're doing it. They were also wanted to open up the society, as he mentioned, so forth. And one of the things they did was bring in new business. A lot of us don't realize that Longs actually started in California. But until Longs came to Hawaii, you had to buy from the plantation dispensary, which sets the prices. So they were doing this. They did this, and they had a tremendous, and they wanted to diversify the economy. Where did we hear that before? And they figured it out, that it's a lot better to work in an air-conditioned hotel than it is in the pineapple fields, believe me. So they diversified the economy. And they were so enthusiastic with doing it. So I used to, in the 70s, when we were reacting to some of these things, I used to try and figure out, because these guys was, in a lot of respects, our heroes. They were our heroes. They were exciting. We're the young Democrats. Madao Yoshinaga, what a guy. He ran the state budget. He did things. These guys believed in education. I'm old enough to know what it was like going to school in Honoka'a when the classes when every class had an A, B, C, D class. And you knew that if you were in the A class, you got a shot to be a policeman. But if you were in the D class, well, you're going to get a bongo card and you're going to work for the plantation. So that all had to change. In fact, that was the last time a legislature sent back the budget requests from the University of Hawaii because it was insultingly too small. See? At the same time, you got to know that they also had an idea of, well, I like to use this example to describe the other side of all of that. And it was, I remember having this conversation with David Trask, who was then the head of the Hawaii Government Employees Union. And I said, David, you don't even golf. Why in the world would you want to go and close down, destroy the only salt lake in the entire state of Hawaii? See, because for us, that was a travesty. He said, yeah, I don't golf, but I was never allowed in a golf club. So we're going to make our own golf course. You see? What was happening in the 70s was the enthusiasm of the parents were being rebelled against by their children. In the 1970s, the students, the young people at the University of Hawaii decided, we don't agree with our parents. This is nuts. They are paving paradise. And Magic Island should be for the public and not to put another hotel, which is the original plan. Hawaiians were wondering, where do they fit in all of this? You see, the unspoken political history of Hawaii is that the Democratic Party was not only part of the Nisei Revolution in Hawaii, which it was, and it's a proud history and it ought to be acknowledged. It was sponsored by a lot of grassroots people. We have a saying in politics, and the saying is real simple. You want something, ask a man. You want something done, ask a woman. And these campaigns, you couldn't run a political campaign. So Tom Gill had a lady named Dallas Jansen helping. This whole island had a bunch of Hawaiian women and their families, starting from Sister Correa to Frenchy de Soto in Waianae, from all the way across this island, underpinning these political victories. And they started to ask themselves, why aren't we part of the dream? And Hawaii then began to change. They began to question this energy. And they began to say, where are our values in this process? And that came into the 78th Constitutional Convention. By the way, the 1980s, most people don't realize this, there was a kind of a counter rebellion. And business said, I want to do this stuff. Hawaiian affairs? I thought that was illegal in America. You got a whole office set up for it? What is going on, And so the Business Roundtable, this is one of the great things that happened, The Business Roundtable put together a conference just like this one to talk about the future of Hawaii and how all of these things that are happening may slow things down and the rest. And they invited to give an address an economist called Milton Friedman. Milton Friedman was a genius, and he was the economist for Barry Goldwater. Gives you a little idea of where the business community was in terms of the political spectrum of Hawaii. But as a young legislator, I was invited to attend this breakfast meeting. And Milton, because I kind of like Milton Friedman. He had a crazy idea. He said we should abolish all the social programs in America and pay some people on what they call a negative tax. By the way, the left wing of America now is considering this. You know, instead of all these social programs, some people pay and some people get paid. It's a lot more efficient. But so he came, he gave his presentation, and the first thing he says, I don't know why you guys are so worried about who lives in Hawaii and who doesn't. The world is made up of a market. This is a great place to grow sugar cane. You bring people over from across the world, they get prosperous growing sugar cane, they raise kids, and their kids move on. Somebody else takes their place. Same thing happens with the hotels. You set up an industry, you bring in the workers, prosperity comes to the family, get your kids well educated, they move on. That works. Well, it works in Iowa, but for the people of Hawaii, even the round table, that was not the Hawaii that we wanted. So it became apparent that we had to get together. That's the point. That we had something different than Iowa. We have something different than Alabama. And that is, we don't like it when our kids are leaving. We all want to live here. We all want to enjoy Hawaii. And so we needed to do things that would keep them here. And so we immediately became a state that planned. We had a vision, a sense of value, starting with the 70s and Governor Ariyoshi. In my time, we had an office of state planning, which we don't have today. Oh yeah, we do in the middle of an agency someplace, but not at the governor's level. So are we capable of dealing with where we are today? See, that's why I'm saying, I don't know, I was kind of cynical about the whole thing. Because no, we are totally incompetent. Because we don't know where we're going. We don't even know what's important. For 50 years, the administration of this state, starting with Governor Burns, Governor Ariyoshi, myself, Governor Cayetano, believed that we needed to develop truck agriculture. We needed to be able to feed all the people in Hawaii. It took 50 years to develop that kind of farming on this island. When it was at the peak of being successful, we reclassified the land urban to build houses. So you see 3 governors testifying against a land use decision to urbanize the land. I thought we were going to feed the people with these land. Neil, you are nuts. We were telling Neil that. He was governor. See, you're crazy. You can't do this. So what we got to ask ourselves when we go through this process of trying to change things, are we really going to make things better? Or are we just going to make the same thing happen faster? While we talk about the fact that it's hard to get approvals to build housing, we ought to know that there are thousands of approved housing developments, housing now available that's not getting built. You know, when I was governor, one of the things we did was I told AmFac, since they were being sold to the mainland guys in Chicago, I asked my attorney general, you know, go down there, file a motion, tell them that, you know, when you, if you don't build White Kelly, we're going to take away your zoning. White Kelly got built. So before we run around fixing things about that don't work, you know, well, you should do that anyway because the whole thing's messed up. But anyway, the point is, take care of where we are. Thousands of housing. You know, Kapolei was a cane field, but we had the energy to go and build it. We started building Kapolei. We're going to build a second city. You know, we had this. Began that process, laid it all out, went out there, and we built the first model houses. I used to have the Hawaiian Airlines fly over that little village so I could point down to my model housing, you know, down there. It got built. The second village was this guy called Stanford Carr wanted, you know, Stanford Carr. So who's Stanford Carr? He's a 28-year-old kid from Maui that never built like 20 houses. So are you guys nuts? We're going to risk our whole project on this teenage guy? You know? And we did. And he built. He built within 2 years 2,000 houses. That's my point. It's not enough to actually just approve stuff. See, so that people can dole it out a little at a time. That's why our kids are leaving. We built thousands of housing because it moved, right? And we dropped the median price of housing in Hawaii. So, when the governor sets out an emergency proclamation to wipe out all the rules, I want to know what's the result. Are we going to actually get housing, or are we going to get more doling out? See? Where are we heading? Who are we doing this for? Who are we doing this for? We got people from Molokai. My cousin, Walter Ritty, 30 years ago, I gave him 5 fish ponds so he could raise fish and feed people on Molokai. He could feed people on Molokai. You know, he took years to work through the federal processing so that he can restore the fish ponds and the rest, right? And as soon as he was done about 4 years ago, the state stopped him. Wait a minute, can I finish off the fish pond? Why? Because it's a historic site. You know, you gotta look at it, not use it. You know, Hawaiians built it to raise fish. It's like all these, you know, you should see this stuff, man. I was in Kona. It is ridiculous. You know, Mauna Lani worked it out so that they are now having nobody can fish in front of the thing. You know, it's called try wait. Try wait 10 years, we're going to bring back the fish. Beautiful idea, you know, but you should hear the people talking about it. The conservationists, oh, it's going to be so wonderful. Our kids can go down there, swim, see the fish. It's going to be like Hunamu Bay. The kupunas over there, oh man, it's going to be so wonderful in 10 years because I can finally eat fish again. Some of this stuff was made to be used. There's nothing wrong with fish ponds. There's nothing wrong with a county, if Molokai wants to be it, that decides they don't necessarily need sidewalks. So maybe we've got to rethink how we do these things. $600 million was given to the Hawaiian Homes program. Yet we are insisting that each house has got to be built on infrastructure that costs maybe over $100,000, but let's say it's $100,000. That's 6,000 homes. Wow! 29,000 people on the waiting list. Here's your 6. Come on, makes sense. I told Bill Isla, Bill, you know when I was growing up on the Big Island? I was growing up on the Big Island. Kauai High had more Hawaiians living on Hawaiian homelands than today. Because now you want to live there, you got to pay $100,000 plus for its infrastructure. There's some families still living there, the Akau family. They built their homestead over 30 years and they're still there. Maybe we got to think about that. Not one size fit all. Not one approval gets a storage of housing. You want to fast track housing, you make sure you build it right now. See? But my only point in doing all of this is to get something off my chest, number one. But number two, where are we going? Why in the world are we going to rebuild a stadium when we never did well with the first one? But that's something for Senator Fukunaga to listen to. But anyway, the problem is, in my opinion, is we are incapable of dealing with this issue because we don't know what we really want. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Those were 3 extraordinary talks. And because we have these amazing guests, I don't want to rob you of any of your time. So the questions I had, I'm not going to ask. And I want to give you in the audience 15 minutes to ask any of these folks a question that you've been wondering. Go ahead.
So I'd like to ask, why do you believe we have never had another constitutional convention since 1978?
Senator Fukunaga?
Well, I don't know if I can answer that for the last 40 years, but I can tell you that when the first Constitutional Convention results came out, the most immediate reaction that occurred in the legislature was the law that counted the votes or identified which votes would be calculated as allowing amendments to pass was increased. So that's one impediment that arose almost immediately. And I think in subsequent years, part of the concerns that have been raised are among those that dealt with marginalized communities or, let's see, LGBT types of rights and other kinds of civil liberties. So it's become very tense and emotional, over the last several years. But I think it's a question that deserves to be asked. It's supposed to come to the legislature to be placed on the ballot every 8 years. And we have subsequently never had another CONCON.
Yes, go ahead.
Hi. Why doesn't the state focus on building around the rail stations? They've had 10 years to think about it. I mean, that was what they were going to do. You could build affordable around there. Forget about the new stadium, too. But it's, I mean, the developers, they're taking advantage of they open up the floodgates with the rules and rushing into town to build things, using up all our tax credits. Why don't we solely focus on places like you were talking about?
Transit-oriented development.
Right. What it's state is supposed to be doing around the rail station. That was the deal.
Senator, that might be another question for you.
Well, I think part of the answer is that many of the areas in and around the Kapolei, I guess, public lands, state lands, don't have infrastructure to support that immediate development. And typically, some of the projects that were initiated and have been approved by the city council and advocated for by the city administration over the last 10 years have been those in areas that already have existing infrastructure. So you're right. There's been a whole slew of projects that have been built in the urban Honolulu area as opposed to the areas where we really intended growth and housing to be developed.
Other questions?
And just a slight snide remark, and a little bit of incompetence in the process, that, and lack of political will. I mean, we should have built the rail station when, we had a great mayor once. We do now, if he's listening. But anyway, with Fosse. And Fosse was irritating as an individual, and I worked for him, actually, and then we worked together because he was mayor when I was governor. And the one good thing about Frank Fosse was he never let grass grow under his feet. And we had some great times together because he would do something. So we started the villages of Kapolei, and he immediately, he was building ever villages. And we were building houses at 60% of the affordable on both homes, both sides. And it was a question of who was going to have the better golf course, so, we could go, and, it was fun dealing with Fosse. If we had built the rail back then, it would have been at a 90% share. Also, most of the rail would have been underground through the city. But by the time we build it, this is now costing us 30, originally it was going to be 30% federal share and 70% local. So you got to cough up the money. The feds have decided that the 30% is a dollar amount. The actual federal share when this is finished, and it needs to be finished, is going to be something closer to maybe 10, maybe 15 if we're lucky. And that's the difference, and that's what takes time, money, and so it's another Hawaii fun project.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so Tom Kaufman started by pointing out that around the time of statehood, the trends were democratic empowerment and accelerating development. And it seems like now we are in exactly the opposite position. We're setting new records for democratic disengagement, new lows for things like voter turnout, and also records for stagnation, low numbers of permits released, increasing delays. So I'd like to hear more about how this change has come about and where we go from here. What can we do in this moment? What do you anticipate is coming next?
Do you want to speak to that, Tom?
Yeah, in response to the question, I want to tell a little story. In the 1970 campaign, for the first time, there was an enormous injection of money, and famously, Governor Burns's reelection campaign spent over $1 million. And subsequently, that became standard, but at the time it was astonishing. Little noticed at that time as a footnote that should be written in 24-karat type was the formation of a carpenters union fund and the emergence of Walter Kupau as from a business agent to an important leader of the trade unions. That then resulted in the carpenters unions clients, contracted clients, coughing up money for what became PRP. The juggernaut, which has become the single greatest force by far in the politics of Hawaii. Okay? And it is a combination of highly paid trade unions, contractors, ancillary uh, uh, players that include engineering firms, particularly big engineering firms, architects, engineers, bankers, realtors. Perhaps some of you have been contacted by this organization. You complain about stagnation, and you complain about things happening over and over with your groundhog metaphor. History doesn't work like that, okay? These things have evolved, and they have specific ways in which they have evolved. One of the experiences I had as a reporter was writing a 14-part series over the sources of campaign finance in Hawaii. And it was published in the early 1970s, at which point this was not really a national subject because it was pre-Watergate, for one thing. It became a national subject with Watergate. And Dennis O'Connor took that information to the legislature, and 2 months after the publication, pushed through the first and really only significant campaign reform bill that we have had. But what it did do was set up the Campaign Finance Commission. It set ceilings, and it provided for transparency and disclosure. So we do know something. But what we don't have is serious control or enough support for public financing to really generate an alternate system. And we're federally stymied by the Supreme Court ruling that says corporations are individuals and can freely pump money through the system through these PACs. So this is not groundhog people, doing things over and over, but this is a campaign finance system in which reform is stultified and will continue to be stultified. I want to try to help this process today, okay, if I could. What could I do? I racked my brain, and I thought it would be to recall that when Dennis O'Connor, who was a tremendously capable person, was pushing this through, I and a couple of other people stayed in close touch with him. And our fear was, well, the business community is not really going to get behind this because the business community feeds off of the symbiotic relationship with the politicians, right? And it was a skeptical view. You might say a cynical view, but it's a skeptical view. What we found was it wasn't true. The business community, cowed by the political system, went along with all of this, but there was a lot of resentment and a lot of feeling of that change was needed, and enough. Dennis tapped into that and got enough business support for campaign finance that this landmark legislation passed. But a lot more needs to be done in this vein. But what I'm saying is that you and those of you who work with the business community, you can find the strength for real campaign finance reform. And you want to change, open up the system by getting away from this this two-handed process, which tends to keep everybody in office and everybody doing the same thing, and occasionally surface in outright corruption, right? And the second thing I want to just throw out, since I've got this microphone in my hand, is create a purposeful island-based Republican Party. And you will help us save Hawaii.
We have 2 more minutes, but Governor, Senator, if you want to provide any final words, I'll give you the opportunity. Yes.
Yeah, this is going to sound like heresy, but we really do need a vibrant opposition party. Because otherwise, the majority is just a matter of factions and personality politics. So you need to be able to, the only way you can actually discipline anything is, and unfortunately, the current opposition party is focused someplace else besides Hawaii. I mean, they might talk about but when you go and you out somebody's Mahu cousin, you're not going to get elected in that district. You might get a few more people voting for you, but it's not going to happen. I have some fun sometimes because I enjoy doing that stuff. I used to go down and talk to the Republican caucus. In fact, I did that about 2 years ago. And I was trying to tell them, following the leader is not necessarily looking for your people. You know what I mean? You got to remember your own heritage. We had a Republican United States Senator called Hiram Fong from Hawaii. He changed the face of America by changing the immigration laws for Asians into this country. That's a huge heritage. You had a Hawaiian prince that started the Hawaiian Homes program. Why aren't you talking about this here? And I just called her a couple of years ago and told former Congresswoman Pat Psyche. I said, Pat, I just want to thank you again for being the person that got the President of the United States to stop the bombing on Kaho'olawe. Now, if that's not a good enough platform to run in Hawaii, I don't know what is. But we do need a good opposition party. So if anybody's out there thinking of organizing, go for it.
Well, with that, we will close the first panel. Thank you so much, Governor Waihee, Senator Fukunaga, and Tom Kaufman.